There is a kind of attack that does not announce itself. It does not come with urgency, noise, or visible force. It does not feel like danger. In fact, it often feels normal, routine, harmless, even necessary. And that is exactly what makes it so powerful. Because what is not recognized is rarely resisted. Every day begins and ends with exposure. Screens light up before thoughts fully settle. Information begins to flow before clarity has a chance to form. Notification, messages, content, and endless streams of input begin to shape attention almost instantly. It happens so quickly, so naturally, that it does not feel like intrusion. It feels like life. But beneath that familiarity, something deeper is happening. Attention is being divided. Focus is being weakened. Inner stillness is being replaced by constant stimulation. And over time, this continuous exposure begins to shape the internal environment in ways that are not immediately obvious. This is how the silent attack works. This is how the silent attack works. Not through force, but through repetition. Not through intensity, but through consistency. Because anything that is repeated daily begins to form patterns. And patterns, once established, begin to define how the mind operates. What once required effort becomes automatic. What once felt unnatural becomes normal. And what becomes normal is rarely questioned. This is where the real danger exists. Because when something becomes normal, it loses its visibility. The constant need to check, scroll, consume, and react begins to feel necessary. Silence begins to feel uncomfortable. Stillness begins to feel unfamiliar. And without realizing it, the ability to remain internally grounded begins to weaken. Not suddenly, but gradually. It is not a dramatic loss. It is a slow erosion. Clarity becomes shorter. Focus becomes fragmented. Thoughts become more reactive. Emotions become more influenced by external input. And over time, the inner world begins to reflect the noise of the external environment. This is not coincidence. It is conditioning. Because the mind adapts to what it is exposed to most frequently. If exposure is constant noise, the mind becomes noisy. If exposure is constant distraction, the mind becomes distracted. If exposure is constant interruption, the mind loses its ability to remain steady. And this affects more than just attention. It affects awareness, the ability to sense what is right, to recognize what is misaligned, to stay connected to deeper clarity. All of this requires a level of internal stillness. But when the mind is constantly stimulated, that stillness becomes harder to access, not because it is gone, but because it is being drowned out. This is why the attack is silent. It does not remove anything directly. It replaces it. It replaces stillness with stimulation. It replaces depth with speed. It replaces clarity with overload. And because these replacements happen gradually, they are rarely noticed until the effects become too strong to ignore. By that time, the pattern is already established, and breaking it requires awareness. Because the first step is recognition. Recognition that not everything being consumed is neutral. Recognition that constant exposure is not without consequence. Recognition that attention is not unlimited. It is a resource that must be protected. This changes the perspective completely. Instead of seeing digital input as harmless background activity, it begins to be seen as something that actively shakes the inner world. Instead of accepting constant stimulation as normal, it begins to be questioned. Instead of allowing everything to enter freely, there is a growing awareness that boundaries are necessary, because what enters consistently begins to remain, and what remains begins to influence everything else. This is why protection matters, not in a fearful way, but in an intentional way, because the goal is not to reject everything. It is to become aware of what is being allowed in, to recognize that attention is valuable, to understand that focus is fragile, and to realize that inner stability must be guarded if it is to remain strong. The silent attack only works when it is ignored. The moment it is recognized, it begins to lose its power. And that recognition is where everything begins to change. The human mind was not designed to process endless streams of information without pause. It was built for depth, for reflection, for moments of stillness where thoughts can settle and clarity can form. But in a world of constant digital input, that natural rhythm is being disrupted in ways that are subtle, yet deeply impactful. Digital overload does not feel like damage at first. It feels like engagement. It feels like staying updated, staying connected, staying informed. There is always something new to see, something new to read, something new to react to. And because everything moves quickly, attention is constantly shifting from one piece of information to another. But this constant shifting has a cost. Focus begins to fragment. Instead of sustained attention, the mind becomes trained for short bursts. It moves quickly, reacts quickly, and then moves on again. Depth is replaced by speed. Reflection is replaced by reaction. And over time, this pattern begins to reshape how the mind operates. This is where inner alignment begins to weaken. Alignment requires stability. It requires the ability to hold a thought long enough to understand it fully. It requires the ability to remain present without needing constant stimulation. It requires a level of internal quiet where clarity can develop naturally. But when the mind is overloaded, that quiet becomes harder to access, because there is always something else demanding attention. Even in moments of stillness, the mind does not immediately settle. It continues to search, to expect, to anticipate the next input. It becomes conditioned to stimulation. And without that stimulation, it begins to feel restless. This restlessness is one of the first signs of disruption. It shows that the mind is no longer comfortable in stillness. And without stillness, alignment cannot fully form. Because alignment is not created in noise. It is created in clarity. And clarity requires space. But digital overload removes that space. It fills every gap with content, every pause with distraction, every moment of silence with input. And as a result, the mind loses its ability to reset. It moves continuously without processing, reacting without reflecting. This creates internal noise, not always loud, but constant. A background layer of thoughts, impressions, and reactions that never fully settle. And when this noise becomes the baseline, it begins to interfere with deeper awareness. Decisions become less clear. Thoughts become more scattered. Emotions become more reactive. And the ability to stay internally grounded begins to weaken. This is not because the mind is failing. It is because it is overloaded. Just like any system, when too much input is received without time to process, performance declines. Efficiency drops. When efficiency drops, clarity reduces, stability weakens, and eventually the system begins to operate below its natural capacity. This is what happens with constant digital exposure. It reduces the mind's ability to function at depth. And when depth is reduced, alignment becomes unstable. Because alignment is not just about knowing what is right, it is about feeling it clearly, holding it steadily, and acting on it consistently. But when the mind is scattered, this becomes difficult. There is too much noise to filter through. Too many inputs competing for attention. Too little space for clarity to form. And as a result, decisions begin to feel uncertain. Focus becomes harder to maintain. And the sense of internal direction begins to fade. This is how overload disrupts alignment, not by removing it completely, but by weakening it gradually. And because the change is gradual, it is often not recognized immediately. It becomes the new normal, a slightly scattered mind, slightly reduced focus, slightly less clarity. But over time, these small shifts accumulate. And what was once sharp becomes dull. What was once clear becomes uncertain. What was once stable becomes reactive. This is why awareness is essential, because without awareness, overload continues unchecked. But with awareness, something begins to shift. There is recognition that not all input is necessary, that not all information is valuable, that constant exposure is not the same as meaningful engagement, and this recognition creates the opportunity for change. Because once the source of disruption is understood, it becomes possible to reduce it, to create space again, to allow the mind to slow down, to restore the natural rhythm that supports clarity and alignment. And when that rhythm begins to return, something powerful happens. Focus strengthens, thoughts settle, clarity re-emerges, and alignment, once weakened, begins to rebuild again. Spiritual sensitivity is not something that disappears suddenly. It does not vanish in one moment or break under one experience. Instead, it fades quietly, gradually, almost unnoticed, until what was once clear becomes distant, and what was once deeply felt becomes difficult to recognize. This is why its loss is so subtle, because it does not feel like loss at first. It feels like normal. Spiritual sensitivity depends on awareness, an inner awareness that is calm, focused, and present. It is the ability to sense beyond surface level thoughts, to recognize what aligns and what does not, to remain connected to a deeper level of clarity that is not influenced by constant external noise. But this kind of awareness requires stillness. It requires space. It requires attention that is not constantly pulled in different directions. And this is where the challenge begins. Because in an environment of constant digital stimulation, attention rarely stays in one place for long. It is continuously shifting, reacting, absorbing, and moving on. And over time, this pattern begins to pull awareness outward, away from the inner space where sensitivity develops. Not abruptly, but gradually. The more attention is directed outward, the less it is directed inward. The more the mind becomes engaged with external input, the less it remains connected to internal awareness. And as this continues, sensitivity begins to fade, not because it is gone, but because it is no longer being accessed consistently. This creates a subtle shift. What was once easily recognized now requires effort. What was once clearly felt now feels distant. What once brought immediate clarity now feels uncertain or delayed. This is not because clarity has disappeared. It is because attention has been redirected. Spiritual sensitivity is like a signal. It requires a clear channel to be received. But when the mind is filled with constant noise, that signal becomes harder to detect. It is still present, still available, still functioning, but it is being drowned out by everything else competing for attention. This is where the function loss becomes noticeable, not as complete absence, but as reduced sharpness. Decisions that once felt intuitive now feel uncertain. Awareness that once came naturally now feels delayed. Inner peace that once felt steady now feels interrupted. And over time, this begins to affect confidence in that inner awareness. Because when sensitivity weakens, trust in it weakens as well. And when trust weakens, reliance shifts outward. More dependence on external input. More searching for answers outside. More need for validation, confirmation, or reassurance. And this further reduces internal connection. It becomes a cycle. The less sensitivity is accessed, the more it weakens. The more it weakens, the less it is trusted. And the less it is trusted, the more attention moves outward again. But the important truth is this: sensitivity is not lost. It is neglected. It remains beneath the surface, waiting for space, for stillness, for attention to return. It does not need to be recreated. It needs to be recreated. And that reconnection begins with awareness, recognizing that constant stimulation has shifted attention outward. Understanding that sensitivity requires intentional space, accepting that depth cannot exist in continuous distraction. This awareness creates the opportunity for restoration, because once attention begins to return inward, even slightly, sensitivity begins to respond. It does not require perfection. It does not demand immediate change. It simply responds to space, moments of reduced noise, moments of intentional stillness, moments where attention is not divided. These moments begin to rebuild connection. And as connection rebuilds, clarity begins to return. Not all at once, but gradually. Just as sensitivity faded over time, it strengthens over time. Each moment of awareness adds depth. Each moment of stillness increases clarity. Each moment of intentional focus restores what was once natural. And over time, something shifts again. What once felt distant begins to feel close. What once felt unclear begins to sharpen. What once felt weak begins to strengthen. Because sensitivity was never gone. It was simply waiting for attention to return. The mind is not just a place where thoughts pass. It is a space where patterns are formed, where beliefs take shape, and where direction is quietly decided long before actions appear externally. It is not neutral ground. It is active, responsive, and deeply influenced by what is allowed to enter it consistently. And yet, in a world of constant access, the mind is often treated as if it has no boundaries. Everything is allowed in. Everything is allowed in. Every idea, every opinion, every piece of content, every emotional tone absorbed without filtering, without pause, without consideration of its long-term impact. And because this happens gradually, it begins to feel normal. But what feels normal is not always healthy, because the mind, when left unguarded, does not remain empty. It becomes filled, and what fills it begins to shape it. This is why guarding the mind is not optional. It is essential, not in a restrictive way, but in an intentional way, because the mind is not designed to process everything equally. It was meant to focus, to prioritize, to filter what is useful and discard what is not. But without conscious boundaries, that filtering process weakens. Everything begins to carry equal weight. And as a result, clarity begins to fade. This is how influence works. Not through one powerful moment, but through repeated exposure. A single thought may not have much impact, but repeated thoughts begin to form patterns. Patterns begin to shape beliefs, and beliefs begin to influence behavior, decisions, and perception of reality. And most of this happens quietly, without awareness. This is why the concept of the mind as a sacred space matters. Because what is sacred is protected. What is sacred is not exposed to everything. What is sacred is valued enough to be guarded intentionally. And when the mind is treated this way, something begins to change. There is awareness of what is being allowed in. There is discernment about what deserves attention. There is intention behind what is consumed, rather than passive acceptance of everything available. This creates control. Not control over the external world, but control over internal influence. Because while external input may be constant, what is allowed to remain internally can be chosen. Not every thought needs to be accepted. Not every idea needs to be entertained. Not every piece of information needs to be absorbed. And this is where real protection begins, by deciding what stays and what does not. Because once something enters repeatedly, it begins to stay longer. And what stays longer begins to shape perception. And perception influences everything: how situations are interpreted, how decisions are made, how emotions respond. This is why unguarded input leads to unstable thinking. Too many conflicting ideas, too many emotional influences, too many perspectives without depth. And over time, this creates confusion. But when the mind is guarded, the opposite happens. Clarity strengthens. Focus becomes sharper. Thoughts become more intentional. There is less internal noise because less unnecessary input is being stored. There is more stability because fewer conflicting patterns are being formed. And as a result, decisions become clearer and more aligned. This does not require isolation. It requires awareness. Awareness of what is being consumed. Awareness of how it affects internal state. Awareness of when something adds value and when it creates noise. And with that awareness, choices begin to change. Not drastically at first, but intentionally. Certain inputs are reduced. Others are removed. Some are replaced with more meaningful, more aligned content. And over time, this reshapes the internal environment, because what enters less frequently loses influence, and what enters consistently begins to define the mind structure. This is the power of guarding the mind. It is not about restriction. It is about protection. It is not about avoiding the world. It is about choosing how the world is allowed to influence internal reality. And once this becomes a practice, something shifts. The mind becomes more stable, less reactive, more focused. More clear, because it is no longer open to everything. It is aligned with what truly strengthens it. And that is what makes it powerful. What has been weakened by constant distraction is not permanently lost. Focus can be rebuilt. Inner strength can be restored. Clarity can return. But this restoration does not happen automatically. It requires intentional effort, steady discipline, and a willingness to reverse patterns that have been reinforced over time. Because distraction, when repeated daily, becomes habit. And habits, once formed, begin to operate without conscious thought. This is why many struggle to regain focus. It is not simply a matter of trying harder. The mind has already adapted to a certain rhythm, quick stimulation, rapid switching, constant input. And when that rhythm is interrupted, even briefly, it can feel uncomfortable. Silence feels unfamiliar. Stillness feels restless. Focus feels difficult to maintain. But this discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of adjustment, because the mind is shifting from one pattern to another, from scattered attention to sustained attention, from constant input to intentional focus, from reaction to control. And this shift requires patience. Focus is not rebuilt in a single moment. It is strengthened gradually, just like any other capacity. It begins with small periods of intentional attention. Moments where distraction is reduced, where the mind is allowed to stay with one thought, one task, one direction without interruption. At first, these moments may feel short. The mind may wander quickly. The urge to check, to switch, to consume something new may arise. But this is part of the process, because every time attention is brought back intentionally, focus becomes slightly stronger. And over time, these small efforts begin to compound. What was once difficult becomes easier. What was once short becomes longer. What was once forced becomes natural. This is how focus is rebuilt. Not through intensity, but through consistency. And as focus strengthens, something else begins to return as well. Inner strength. Inner strength is the ability to remain steady regardless of external influence. It is the capacity to hold direction without being easily pulled away. It is the ability to maintain clarity even when distractions exist. But this strength weakens when attention is constantly divided, because divided attention creates divided energy, and divided energy cannot remain stable for long. This is why rebuilding focus also rebuilds strength, because when attention becomes unified again, energy becomes unified, and when energy gets unified, direction becomes stronger. Decisions become clearer, actions become more intentional. This creates a sense of control that was previously missing. Not control over everything externally, but control over internal state. The ability to choose where attention goes. The ability to maintain direction without constant interruption. The ability to stay aligned even when distractions are present. This is where real strength exists, and it is built through repetition. Daily moments of intentional focus. Daily reduction of unnecessary distraction. Daily commitment to staying present with what matters. These actions may seem small, but their impact is significant, because what is repeated daily begins to reshape the mind. Old patterns weaken, new patterns strengthen, and over time, the internal environment begins to change. There is less restlessness, less urge for constant stimulation, less dependency on external input, and more stability, more clarity, more control. This is the result of rebuilding. It is not immediate, but it is certain, because the mind responds to what it is consistently trained to do. If it is trained to focus, it becomes focused. If it is trained to remain steady, it becomes stable. If it is trained to operate with intention, it becomes intentional. And once this level of focus and strength is restored, something powerful happens. External distractions lose their influence.